Hi, good evening. Thank you everyone for attending this event tonight. Sorry, if we can get started. Our speakers are very keen to get speaking. My name is Shabana Salim. I'm chairing an event that we have. Obviously, I'm sure you're aware that it's Nikkah to register or not to register. Sorry, can you not hear me at the back? Can you hear me now? Okay, great. City Circle, some of you may not be familiar with it. It's a charity that runs several initiatives. One of the charity initiatives that I get involved with is the public lectures, the one that you're attending tonight as an example. We hold weekly lectures. They're for the public. They can be on legal, social, political issues, really what we feel the public require or is in demand. One of the other projects that we do is that we have the homeless shelter on a Sunday, and we have a Saturday school for children who are in impoverished areas. Now, all of these initiatives require funding, and you may have found a small little slip directing you to our website where we request donations. So we'd be very, very grateful if, however much or little you can donate to help support these initiatives, that you do that. And preferably the sooner the better, because I don't know if you're anything like me, but when I leave I tend to forget things and I get busy. There's also a standing order form at the back if you'd like to contribute. If you'd like to get involved in any one of these projects, there's also a sign-up form at the back, whether you'd like to organise a lecture, you'd like to be a speaker, or get involved in a Saturday School or Homeless project, please do sign up and we'll get in touch with you. If there are any lawyers in the room, the official register for the CPD points is at the back on the right side next to the door. So without further ado, the event itself is on the Muslim marriage ceremony, the Nikkah. The discussions we'll be having tonight are centred around whether or not that should be registered, the mechanism of it being registered, the issues that are currently surrounding the fact that it's not legally recognised, whether that should be reformed or if it should be reformed, and if it shouldn't be, why not. Our speakers will explore each of those issues with you. They're all very experienced in this area. First we have Ian Edge, who's on my far right. He works in civil and commercial laws of the Middle East and impressively founded the Centre of Islamic and Middle East Law at SOAS. He was its director until 2013, and he's previously served on the International Committee of the Bar Council and is currently a member of the President of the Family Division, International Advisory Committee on Islamic and Middle East Affairs. So keep that in mind if any questions that you have, you'd like him to answer those. On my immediate right, we have Emma Thompson. He is a member of the Bar of England and Wales since 1979, so a very experienced barrister. He co-founded the Association of Muslim Lawyers, and he has served as the head of Wind Chambers since 1994. He's also the author of several books, far too long a list for me to detail at present, but most notably, he made representations to the House of Lords in 2002 on religious offences, arguing that different religious groups should have equal rights and protection under English law. On my left, we have Aina Khan, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with also. She's the founder and director of the Register Our Marriage campaign, which is one of the things that prompted this event tonight. Aina is the head of the Islamic department at Duncan Lewis Solicitors, and she's developed a niche in the past 20 years in this particular field and also the issues that are surrounding it. She's worked a lot in leading reforms that should be made to address a lot of the injustices and human rights abuses that cause a lot of injustice to women and children. And then finally, perhaps best till last, as Ajmal might think, we have Ajmal Masroor, an imam and broadcaster. He's previously trained with Relate as a relationship counsellor and has been delivering relationship awareness programs for the last 10 years. He works a lot on these issues on a grassroots level, and so will have an interesting insight to give us. He's also obtained an MA in Islamic Studies, as well as completing his education in an Islamic school with renowned scholars. He's founder of the Barefoot Institute, which specialises in providing coaching and counselling services. So those are our speakers. I've asked them, as hard as it might be, to limit themselves to 10 minutes tonight so we can hear from each of them, because as is most often the case with any of our lectures, the focus of the evening is predominantly the comments and the questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ian.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people here this evening, and I'm very pleased to be here to try and shed a little bit of light on what's a very intractable problem, the issue of Islamic marriage, Nikkah, and the fact that there's the shocking statistic of 80% of mosques not registered for Islamic marriages to be recognised by the state, and 80% of Islamic marriages not therefore recognised, and so don't come within the normal legal system. What I've been asked to do is to give you the present legal position on Nikkah in English law, in a sort of nutshell, which I'll attempt to do in 10 minutes. How did we get to where we are at the present? Well, first, a little bit of history. The only marriage that England accepted, English law accepted, initially was religious marriage, but of course religious Christian marriage. Initially of the Catholic Church, and then after Henry VIII, the Church of England. And that was governed by canon law. The state as such, if it existed, or in the way it existed, didn't involve itself in the development of the law. And that continued up until the beginning of the 18th century, until 1753. And the reason the state got involved in marriage then was because of property. Because there were a large number of cases where young heiresses to great landed estates were being, sometimes forcibly, sometimes willingly, taken away and married against the wishes of their parents. And large landed estates were getting into the hands of people that the elite in England weren't happy about. You only have to read Jane Austen to realise these sorts of factual instances. And so something, it was considered, had to be done, and what was done was the first real marriage act in England, the Marriage Act of 1753, known by the rather wonderful title, the Clandestine Marriages Act, or the Secret Marriages Act, because it was implemented to prevent this sort of religious marriage where particularly the parents didn't have any say in what went on. And how it turned religious marriage into a state concern was actually very clever. What it did was it made all Church of England vicars essentially marriage registrars of marriage. And it introduced a new part to what had been a purely religious ceremony before by introducing a registration part to the ceremony. I don't know how many of you have ever been to a Church of England marriage, but at the end of the vows and so on, the parties disappear generally into a vestry or somewhere in a side chapel in order to sign the register with the vicar, and then they come back and the ceremony ends as they come out of church. And the vicars, of course, were appointed by a central authority, by the Church of England. And so the state didn't have to get involved in any issues of what qualifications did they need, because that was all done by the Church of England. So it was a very clever thing to do. No choice, of course, on the vicar's part as whether or not they wanted to act as marriage registrars. And for a period of time after 1753, the only marriage that you could have that was valid in England was a Church of England marriage, which was very difficult for those people which either didn't want to have a religious marriage at all, or were Catholic or Jewish or anything else. The state involvement in and recognition of the religious church marriage, Church of England marriage, was extended to the Jews and to the Quakers. Perhaps because they both had a central authority that could qualify synagogues and the celebrants in the various places of worship, both Jewish and Quaker. But it wasn't until 1837 that civil marriage was introduced for those people that didn't want a religious marriage, and also a new provision for the registration of a place of worship of a different religion. So if you were a Catholic, then the Catholic Church had to use this new legislation to register each individual church. If you were a dissenter, then the same. And if you were a Muslim, the same. The Woking Mosque is one of the very earliest mosques to be created in the UK, and that is a registered mosque and was registered at a very early stage. But that creates a bit of a mess, really, in relation to marriage law. Different laws applying to different religions and different provisions. That mess was codified in the Marriage Act of 1949. It is what we have still today. It's been tinkered with by the amendments of various bits of legislation, but essentially it's the same. The French, of course, didn't have all this problem because they just, in the revolution, got rid of religious marriage completely, and the only valid marriage you have in France is a civil, secular marriage, which is one way of doing things. But the English method, of course, is always compromise, even if that does produce some rather odd results. So is the Marriage Act 1949 still fit for purpose today? Clearly in relation to the Muslim community, where the provisions in it for the registration of mosques and Islamic centres are not being used substantially, and where large numbers of marriages are not being registered, in my view, it isn't fit for purpose. So the question then is how to change it. And there are, I think, a number of methods by which you can do that. The first and easiest, well, not the easiest, but the first way would be what the present campaign is doing, which is to try and promote the idea that religious marriage plus secular marriage, a registration, is a way forward. There's nothing wrong in adding a separate addition to an Islamic marriage. There's nothing prohibited in adding an extra condition. It doesn't change in any way the underlying validity of the religious marriage. A second option would be to try and promote the registration of more mosques and Islamic centres. Again, something perhaps that's easier to say than do. So you come to the third option, which is to change the law. The law itself needs changing, and I'm sure Ahmed is going to tell you that there is a terrible discrimination in relation to certain religions. Why is the Church of England, Jews and Quakers given this advantage that other religions don't have? There are a number of ways of changing the law. One is to act in relation to the particular problem. The real problem is the vulnerability of women who find that they're not protected by state law. So one method would be to say, well, give financial relief, to give the protection of the state to them when their marriage is dissolved, even though the marriage itself may not be recognised. And that's a very good, in my view, temporary solution, but it can only ever be a temporary solution. The second possibility is to, instead of registering places, register people. Register the celebrants, the Muslim celebrants in the various mosques and Islamic centres. Now that's been done in Wales and Scotland, but as Aina told me today, actually, it hasn't worked terribly well in Scotland. And so that's not, again, necessarily a way forward. So you come back to the state has got to in some way recognise an Islamic ceremony of marriage. And how can it do that? It can do it in a number of ways. It can, with the assistance of the community, add a registration process to an Islamic marriage. And that is something that most Islamic countries have actually done. Almost no Islamic country in the Middle East now has a simple Sharia marriage without some form of registration. In fact, in most countries, you have to go through the marriage in a court or before a marriage registrar before it's considered to be valid. So there wouldn't be anything wrong in adding that as an addition here, in my view. Or finally, you can simply say, as I'm sure Ahmed is going to say, you simply recognise all the Islamic ceremonies, you recognise that the various Sharia councils are permitted to apply their own law, and you don't get the state involved at all. But I think that has various consequences, which I'm happy to talk about in the questions.
Thank you very much.
As I've been told. If I'm not told to stop, I'll go on forever.
And we're looking forward to hearing some more. So if we can move on now to Emmet. So if you could pass the microphone.
Go, sorry.
Good evening and good to see everyone here. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. First of all, I'd like to thank Ian for that very enlightening kind of historical perspective, because it demonstrates very graphically that the English law is not written in stone. It's something that has changed over time and has tried to adapt, usually a bit behind the times, to changing social realities. So just because we're stuck with a law that we don't like, there are ways and means of actually changing that law so that it's kind of more user-friendly and more useful for the people alive in the present age. I think the other thing I'd like to just say as a general remark also is that for the three of us on the panel, or the four of us who are lawyers, and probably Ajmal in his experience as a counsellor, we're used to dealing with situations where something's gone wrong, and somehow we have to try and improve the situation of people who come to us. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are happily married, or more or less happily married, who never have to go to any kind of court, who if they divorce do it amicably and in the best way, and who make arrangements for the children of the marriage if there are children, without there having to be any acrimony or bitterness or battles. One has to remember that obviously there is always a significant number of people who do need access to some kind of legal decision, and often where people are really ignoring the law, whatever it is, whether it's civil law or Sharia law, there has to be a way of saying, look, these are your responsibilities, especially towards the children. You brought them into the world, you helped bring them into the world, you're responsible for their maintenance and for their upbringing, for their education. So this is the kind of nitty-gritty area that we're looking at, really. It's where things have gone wrong. Usually amongst the Muslim community, it's the people who ignore the Sharia, who abandon it, or who don't even know what it is, that get into difficulty, that ends them up in a situation that needs some kind of decision to put it right as much as is possible. Now, the other thing that Ian has highlighted very helpfully is that at the moment we have an unsatisfactory situation, really, as far as all the minority faiths are concerned. And I'd even say include the Sephardic Jewish community in that. There has to be this kind of compromise, as Ian alluded to, of what the teachings of the original prophet are and what the secular state law demands or requires. And sometimes they're diametrically opposed, sometimes they're not in harmony, sometimes they are in harmony. But it's really seeing how do we find a balance between the two, because in any society, and certainly under the teachings of the Sharia, if you're a minority Muslim community in any country, you have to abide by the law of the country. And at the same time, if you wanted to have that law changed to recognise your religious rights, which are guaranteed to you on paper by the Human Rights Act 1998, which Mr. Cameron would love to get rid of and replace with we're not quite sure what, then there are ways and means of changing the law. You can't take it into your own hands, you can't overthrow the state, you have to lobby through Parliament and until the law is promulgated that will serve everyone better. And certainly what I've been involved in really in the last 30 years, 40 years, is just the recognition of Muslim personal law. There's no way that the English secular law is going to recognise the had punishments of Islam, and there's no way that they're going to implement them. And we as Muslims recognise that they are where people are following the Deen and following the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The situations where the had has to be imposed are very few and far between. But the way that the media kind of melodramatically says, if we have Sharia law recognised, then everyone's going to be having all their hands chopped off and their backs whipped and they're going to be stoned to death. And you have this picture of complete havoc and mayhem, which is not actually what, if you look historically at the record, has never happened. In 14 centuries of Islamic history, you find that wherever Islam is established, you have a very civilized society, very good relations between people and between minority faiths within the Muslim rule. And it all works fine until people start to leave it, because it's in the nature of reality that nothing lasts forever. And you can have something that's built on very firm foundations and it's looked after, but a time will come when it begins to decay and become corrupted until the end it collapses, and then something else will grow in its place. And in a way, we kind of see that happening with the present society. It's immersed in usury. It's on very shaky foundations, and at some point it will collapse. And with it, much of the rule of law that really all sensible people seek to uphold, because it gives certainty in the transactions between people in modern society. And therefore it's just a question of how do we, if you like, reform, not the Sharia, because it's in no need of reform, but how do we reform the English secular law, which has always been reformed because it's man-made. And whereas God gets it right first time, people tend to not. Having made those general comments, and bearing in mind that I haven't got that much time left, what I've always advocated is that the English law should simply recognise Muslim personal law, so that if you have a Nikkah marriage and the conditions of the Sharia and Sunnah are fulfilled, it's recognised as a valid marriage. And this is what happens with all the marriages overseas. This is what happened in the time of the Raj. The Muslim personal law was recognised by the British rule, and there was no kind of interference with it. There was no additional ceremony that had to be gone through, as long as it was registered, because then you have a record that the marriage has taken place, the conditions were fulfilled. There were at least 2 witnesses, there was a wali, there was an agreed mahar, etc. Both parties to the marriage gave their consent, there was no force involved. All of these requirements of the Sharia were complied with, then it would be recognised. And this is the position today, as Ian has pointed out. So if a Nikkah marriage in, say, Pakistan is recognised as a valid marriage, why on earth can't it be recognised as a valid marriage here? And the same goes for divorce. If it is recognised in Pakistan, and again it has to be registered and the requirements have to be fulfilled, why on earth can't it be recognised in England? It's very simple. Because you see, the danger is that if you have this compromise that Ian alluded to, where you have the religious ceremony and then you have the civil ceremony side by side, what happens is that the imam or the vicar, whoever it is in a pickle, because the Nikkah marriage is in accordance with the Sharia of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But when you make a contract under civil law, suddenly the wording changes. And what a lot of people don't realise when they say we must register Muslim marriages is that you have to do both ceremonies. It's not that you have the Nikkah ceremony and then it's registered. You actually have to do both ceremonies, and one contradicts the other. Because the civil ceremony doesn't pay any attention to what Allah has required of people whatsoever. And it has what it thinks is pragmatic in the French way of looking at things, but it is limiting, in fact. It is not as generous as the Sharia. So that's one problem. And people have said, well, instead of just registering the place of worship, another problem is that sometimes the marriage is not celebrated in the mosque, it can be celebrated in the house. I myself have been asked to kind of carry out several Nikkah ceremonies, and some have been in private houses, some have been in hotels. Not one has been in a mosque, in fact. They are valid marriages, all the conditions fulfilled. We also had a paper record, documentary record of the marriage, so that all the details are there, so that no one starts arguing about what the mahar was and what was immediate and what's deferred, all of these conditions. And therefore, people have suggested, well, look, why don't we register the person rather than the place of worship? The trouble with that is that most people who have any fear of Allah and any taqwa will not wish to come to an agreement where they contradict the Sharia and the Sunnah and say, well, you've just made this contract under the Sharia, but now you have to make a separate contract under civil law, and it's different and it contradicts it, but just it doesn't matter, just go through it quickly and then forget it, and inshallah everything will be all right. But if it isn't all right, if the marriage does break down, what Aina will argue is that at least if that has happened, that process, then the mother and the children especially will have access to the British courts in order to gain especially maintenance and to get their rights, which are recognised under civil law but not under a marriage which is not recognised by civil law, which includes the Nikkah marriage. And again, I would say that the way around this is if you recognise the Nikkah marriage, recognise the Muslim talaq or khula divorce, if it's the lady asking for the divorce, then the rights will then be accessible in the British courts. And I would say also that the Sharia councils, that their role is, because they really can't give binding judgments that can be enforced, they can just say this is what we recommend. And they could work very well with the British system to say this is what we would advise under the Sharia, this is the maintenance to which the wife and children are advised. If you make that part of your order, everything will be in order. But it's time for me to stop as well. So.
Thank you. If I can introduce now Aina.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Good evening and thank you for turning up in such large numbers. I'm so happy to see you all ready to engage in a good discussion after we've finished speaking. So I hope you're all still listening. And Ajmal, I pity you because you're going to have to keep them engaged for the next 20 minutes now. We have 10 minutes each for such a huge topic. How do we do that? Well, I want to go back to the original topic. Do you remember what it was? To register or not to register? I would argue strongly in favour to say you must register. Why? You register your car, well, register your marriage. It's as simple as that. Otherwise, let's all stop obeying British law, drive through red lights, not register our cars, and do a bit of speeding. There's nothing wrong with any of that because you're doing your own thing. As a lawyer, I believe law is a force for good and it must ensure the good of society rather than just the individual. So starting without making it a Muslim issue, I'm going to start making it a legal issue for you. If you look in that way, then isn't it the duty of Muslims to actually add value to their society and not create fitna or harm? I'll leave it to Ajmal to talk about the Islamic side. I'm going to tell you my own personal experience because you'd like to know what happens on the ground. The legal side has been set out, the Islamic position has been set out. I'm going to say what the harsh reality is. And that, very briefly, is that few of you are aware of the crippling problems that are facing the couples and the children in unregistered religious marriages. The reason you're not aware of it is because it's growing without you realizing it. It's an actual ticking time bomb. It's the youngsters in our society, those under 30, who are most at risk. So it's actually potentially going to be explosive. And I'm not being alarmist, I'm just telling you that I've seen in the last 5 years a dramatic increase for this problem in my daily practice. I'm the head of the Islamic department in a very major firm, one of the biggest firms in the country. So we get a lot of calls. And every day this issue comes up. The background is that this legal aspect affects all minority faiths equally. The Hindus, Sikhs and others are registering. There's no point in denying that fact that other communities are self-regulating and they are volunteering to comply with the civil system. Why are Muslims the only community increasingly not doing so and going the opposite way? We need to ask why. Perhaps you're pondering on the reasons already and it's going through your mind. I'll tell you a few that come to me regularly and that should help you formulate your thoughts. Sheer widespread ignorance of the law is probably the main one. Not forgetting Muslims, most people in the street outside, if you stop them and asked, they would think there's such a thing as common law marriage, that you have rights as a result of cohabitation. If you've been living together 2 years or more or have a child, you have rights. I hate to break it to you, but that's only going to be debated right now with the cohabitation bill when it has its first reading. It's not even started yet, that debate. And it's a long time coming. With the colour of this government, which is blue, and very dedicated to the concept of marriage rather than cohabitation, I actually believe it would be a lot longer for you to have cohabitation rights unless something dramatic happens. So what do we do in the meantime? If marriage is being given such a high status in society, why don't we know our rights? Well, the next point is complacency. Everybody getting married thinks, well, we'll get round to it one day. We have to have a Muslim marriage. We can't live together like all our friends who are non-Muslim may be doing, because there's no fashion of people rushing to get married straight away. They like to live together first. We're all the same, but we can't live together, so we have to get married. That's one of those reasons. Lack of commitment, usually from the man who says, let's see how it goes. Let's not get married just yet. Let's see how it goes. And it breaks up before it's even got off the starting track. Deliberate avoidance. I hate to say this, but there is growing deliberate avoidance of the court system by men and wealthy women. A lot of women, including a couple of barristers and solicitors in the last year alone, have told me that they choose not to get married because they don't want to share their wealth. That's the current situation. People are really upset by the notion of a 50-50 split, if that's the way they see it in the papers. There's a belief that the Islamic ceremony is all that matters. People say that to me all the time. We don't care about this man-made law. All that matters is the law of Allah. Let's debate that. What is the law of Allah? Is it a few Arabic words? No, it's actually justice for the parties in that marriage and no harm caused as a result of that marriage. So that maybe is what an Islamic marriage is. Let's think about that. There's naivety, there's trust that nothing will go wrong, there's the idea that you can't have polygamous marriage. If you have a registration of a Nikkah, we must leave the way open for polygamous marriages. And finally, a growing problem since 2013, when the law changed for same-sex marriage, a lot of imams are telling me that they fear the fact that they could be challenged and asked to perform a ceremony of same-sex marriage, and they don't want to get involved in that discussion. So it's the same parallel experience with the Church of England, Catholics, etc. The harsh reality is, what does that mean? Well, we're nearly 3 million Muslims, or more than 1 million in London alone. If you're taking even 10% of those not registering their marriages, that, as you can work out, is more than 100,000 away. My statistics are shocking. They're showing that under 30, the age of 30, more than 80% are saying to me they haven't registered their marriages. There's no data, we need the data, but sadly anecdotal evidence is all we've got. So I say prove me wrong. Do your own research and prove me wrong. But if you go through the ceremonies you've been through in the last 2 years, you'll find the majority are not registering. Not at the time of the Nikkah anyway. Later on, perhaps, but it's very, very vulnerable for them. Now I need to wrap up by saying to you that what the effect of this is important for you to consider as a lawyer. Overnight homelessness and destitution happens all the time to very high professionals and achieving women. They are locked out overnight. They rely on their own families or welfare benefits. The ex-partner's debts, they're saddled with those without any recourse to his property or assets because they've been naive and taken out loans for him. They've put, one client of mine put £400,000 of her earnings, her own earnings, into a family home only to be told that marriage that you thought was real is not. It's not registered. They're not even treated as next of kin on divorce, so I've had coroners arguing in my case between the mother of the deceased and the Islamic wife who's going to have the body. We've got clients abroad who are risking, one woman was imprisoned in Syria and her child was going to be taken away because the husband said, what marriage? There's no certificate. Take the child away. She's had a child out of wedlock. There's horrific things happening to British citizens. But day to day, just to wrap up what is happening, this is the fact that it will happen to each one of you. If you went and asked your family and friends now, there's not one of you here who don't know of somebody who will suffer as a result of an unregistered religious marriage. My argument is, as a Muslim as somebody whose duty it is to create justice in this world, there is no alternative. I would argue you should protect women and children the way Islam did 1400 years ago. When after the age of Jahiliyyat, ignorance, where men used women and never gave them their names or their own property, women were given the status of wives, and he who is best amongst you is he who is best to his wife. We're not doing that. That hadith is not being followed. So I argue that we're back to the age of ignorance, Jahiliyyat, and we need to come and show what Islam really means. Thank you.
Thank you, Aina. If I can now introduce Ajmal to end this evening's discussion.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Beneficent. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening to you all. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for inviting me. After having heard the distinguished panel, I don't think I've got much to say except to thank them first for giving us a great insight. I'm just going to give you some anecdotal evidence as well as my own personal experiences as to why I believe our marriages must be registered. It should not be unregistered. And in fact, if I had the permission to issue fatwas, I would give a fatwa to say it is a requirement that we register our marriage. But I don't have that permission, so please don't quote me and don't write it down. My teachers would probably be, my teachers would be probably horrified if they hear, but they are quite often horrified when they hear me say lots of things, but that's okay. No problem, you can record it. So the reason why I believe this is because it's based on three simple principles. My dear brother Ahmed talked about the purpose of Sharia and how it's misunderstood. The primary purpose of Sharia is what Aina highlighted, which is to uphold justice at all costs. And the verse of the Quran is very clear. Uphold justice even if it means you have to go against your own self, your own families, and all your parents. You must always serve justice. Don't let your hatred of other people sway you from justice. God says that in the Quran. He says, justice is closest to godliness. Not prayer, not fasting, but justice. So the primary purpose of Islamic law is to serve justice. How does it make justice available and possible? By guaranteeing what we call maqasid of Sharia, the objectives of Sharia. Objectives of Sharia are 5 according to most scholars, but you can add a few more if you want. The 5 that I'm very, very familiar with is to protect life, protect intellect, property, faith, and family. The 5 sacrosanct aspects of our life that Sharia must protect. And that's the reason why I believe marriage registration is essential. Let's face some realities. We are not the majority in this country. The majority are of a different tradition and a very different history, I understand that. The legislation that has developed and evolved over time has been fed by those traditions as well as the secular tradition that we see very prevalent in our country today. And that's our reality, and we've accepted that. And that's why we are British citizens, we are very much at home here. That's not the issue. The issue is we're still very devout Muslims. We adhere to our faith and we sign up to that faith very well. We are not going to change the British law to make it Islamic law. We can't. That's not the desire of the majority of the people. However, we as people here must also have our rights and our sensitivities protected. If we are going to get married using Islamic Nikkah process, which is what all of us would do, why not register that marriage while the recognition of our Nikkah marriage is yet 10-15 years away? So, while I support Ahmed's suggestion, and that is that the government should recognize Nikkah as a valid contract and also enforce it, that's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen over a longer period. We need to continue lobbying it, I agree. But right now, thousands of men and women are getting married without any legal protection, just by doing what I call backstreet Nikkahs. Many people have come to me, said, I got married to somebody, and who did you have Nikkah? My mate in my university was the one who presided over. I got 2 friends from the cafe, and we sat down and we did the Nikkah. Well, I'm really sorry. that is not a nikah. That is a joke. For in Islamic nikah, and Allah says that in the Quran, God said that very clearly, that the contract that you take, that contract must always be enforceable. Otherwise, what's the point of a contract? And in Islam, a contract is invalid unless there are witnesses. Quran says that. So an Islamic marriage, even if there is witnesses, can't be enforced because it's not registered. What is the point of that contract? It makes it almost a joke. So this backstreet marriage culture must be quite unequivocally stopped within our community and must be stopped immediately. And I say this to you with greatest of respect. Many of you, if you're married and if you have not done your registration, why haven't you done your registration? What are you scared about or scared of? Is it that your assets will be distributed equally at the end if there is a problem? What is it that you're trying to run away from? Is it that you're commitment phobe and you've got a problem just in case you're going to keep your door open and run? I come across too many cases like that. And often it's our sisters, our ladies who become the victim of this very unscrupulous practice in my view. Ladies become the primary caretakers of their children, the mother, the centre of a child's upbringing, and the man suddenly decides, okay, you know what, I'm going. It's happened so many times. So in order to avoid all of that, I actually recommend people to do the registration first before they come to do the nikah. And it must become a mandatory practice amongst ourselves. The third thing that I want to say to you is the emotional consequence of non-registered marriage. A lady or a man has come to a committed contract or so-called contract that is non-enforceable. In their mind, they're constantly worried. I can do nothing about it. This morning I received a phone call. A lady called, somebody else called me saying, can you please help? Somebody very senior in our community. I said, what's the matter? This lady, her husband left her 5 years ago, but doesn't want to issue her divorce. He goes to a country where he's from, he stays there for a while, comes back, goes back. He comes every 2 years to renew his visa. But he's not interested in ending the marriage, but also not interested in sustaining the marriage. What should she do? So she approached the Sharia Council to get a khula. Sharia Council won't give a khula because they want to speak to that man, and that man is not contactable. So she's been stuck in a limbo for 5 years. And all of that is because there was no registration done for that marriage here. Had she done the registration here, she could have filed in the courts of our country to annul the marriage, and if the marriage was annulled in our civil court, Sharia Council would have no choice but to annul it and issue a khula. I'm not saying we should bypass the law of God. We're saying the secular country in which we live, the reality is we can't enforce the law of God here. What we can do is utilize the opportunities that we have in front of us to make sure our marriages are safe and our families are safe. Our wife, our children, our husband, they're all safeguarded. And that's the essence of Islamic law. And finally, a long time ago, when I was thinking about getting married, and I said to some of my friends, what do you think about me getting married and I'm going to go to the local registrar's office? And they also don't do it. Why not? They said the headache is too much. It's better not to get into the headache. What's the headache? I couldn't understand it. So, in front of God, if our pledge is to be truthful and sincere, is that fear truthful and sincere? I don't think so. God is my witness. God knows what is in my heart. So ultimately, nikah needs simple conditions to be fulfilled. Number one, it should be consent given by two people. There should be proposal and acceptance, as we know. That's the first condition. Two witnesses, adult and sane. Two witnesses. Mahar should be agreed upon between the man and the woman. Though the woman could waive the mahar willingly, not to be forced to be waived on the first night of marriage. Really, darling, can you forgive me? I can't pay you. What's she going to say to you at that moment in time? No, unless you pay me. She's not going to say that. So, no, I'm talking about seriously saying yes or no to mahar and understanding what's going on. And a public solemnization of marriage or declaration of marriage. That's it. That's all what Islam requires when it comes to marriage.
Presence of the wali.
Of course. No. Presence of the wali, I'm not saying is not the requirement in the sense that it's not universally agreed by all four schools of thought. Though, schools of thought also say the presence of wali is important, but some say it isn't. So I didn't use that as the primary condition, though it is the secondary condition. I prefer all the time to invite the wali to be present. But remember this, the conditions that are met, as far as I'm concerned, as soon as you meet them, you have done the marriage. But it must be registered, otherwise you're not protected. So I'm calling for, and I'm saying I'm with Aina on this, that let's get our marriage registered. And I'm also with my dear brother Ahmed to say, let's lobby our government. Let's have more of you in the parliament so that you can start doing that work that is so important, so that we can have Nikkah also accepted as a legal contract, just like it's accepted across the world in all Muslim countries. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wow, everyone's been pretty amazing with their timings tonight, I have to say. So thank you to each of our speakers. I know 10 minutes is an incredibly short space of time to talk about a lot of issues. Part of the reason for that is because our lectures like to focus and engage with the audience. So I've had a lot of different things from a lot of different speakers. I have a few questions of my own, but before we get started, we tend to get about 40-50 people turn up to our lectures. There's such a huge number tonight, probably double that. I'd like to take advantage of the numbers to ask you, and be honest, because I have to say, before I studied law and before I became a family barrister, I didn't know that nikkahs weren't recognised. So if I could get a show of hands of those people who didn't know that the nikkah is not legally recognised, or that common law marriages don't exist. Well, thank you. Thank you, but some people are being quite shy. Come on. If I can get those hands a bit higher, because I can't see from over here. Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, having heard what you have tonight, can I get a show of hands for those people who would support it being recognised? If you could keep your hands up, actually, because this is quite interesting. It's not actually everyone. I can't start off.
We're saying recognised, not registered.
Absolutely.
Recognised, yes.
Recognised, yeah.
Ben, have you counted?
About 51.
51. I've counted, there's about 90 people there, so that's quite a high number that haven't put their hands up. Now, who here doesn't wish for the nikkah to be recognised? And who here doesn't fall into either of those categories? That might be because you hold a different view or you just don't know yet. No, I'll do them. Sorry, if you could put your hands up a bit higher. That's 6, that's 7, that's fine. Same question, so do you feel that the nikkah should be do you feel that you should register the nikkah? Less of you think that than recognition, okay. And how many of you feel that you should not register the nikkah? That is very interesting. And how many of you don't fall into either of those categories? Great. About the same. Great. That to me is actually quite startling because I wasn't expecting the numbers to fall the way that they did. There are about 51 of you who supported it being recognised, and there are about 30 of you that supported it being registered. Great disparity. So really one of the questions that I'm going to put up to all of our speakers to consider is, we've heard a lot about celebrants, and some of you won't be lawyers. We've had it explained that celebrants are people who tend to get, you can get registered and you get a license to perform marriage ceremonies. So that means the marriage ceremony itself doesn't have to be in a particular place or in a particular form. There are different regulations and rules depending on which country that system is applicable in. My question to each of the speakers to consider is really, what's your position on that? And we heard it being mentioned that that may not be a good system, and why is that the case if that's your view? Before I ask the speakers to answer that, I'd like to field some questions from the audience or comments. So please don't feel like you need to ask a question. If I could get a show of hands for those who'd like to ask a question or get a comment, and I'll pick a few of you at a time. So if I could get the gentleman at the back holding a piece of paper, holding that piece of paper up. Gentleman at the front, I think you put your hand up. The lady on the right and the gentleman on the left. So if I could start in that order. So sorry, there was a gentleman at the back, he put his hand up with the pamphlet, yes. If you could say your name and just introduce yourself before you.
Aina Khan.
Thank
My
you.
question is, what about polygamy? Polygamy is, in my understanding, allowed in Islam. So how would that practice of polygamy impact upon your registration of marriages in the UK?
Great, thank you for that. And second?
Two questions. That's it.
I know you, Islam, but if you could introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Islam.
too.
I'm an imam, but I'm also researching for PhD Muslim family law in the UK, in particular divorce. So that's my status. My question is regards to the issue of being British citizens and the fact that we have free choice and informed choice regards to consenting to the type of marriage that we have. Because the issue is, do we register or not to register? The question being is, some of the speakers alluded to the fact they want to help the vulnerable people. I'm doing some research, I don't want to go into it too much at the moment, but the research is showing that women are, more than half the people I interviewed were in civil registered marriages with Nikkah. It was an informed choice they made, and the ones who wanted to do Nikkah, again, it was an informed choice. But what is the problem? What is the vulnerability that you're trying to help? Because the common problem I found with these women was they were suffering domestic violence, in-law interference, the issue of, withholding religious divorce, and so on. So how would a registry of a marriage help them in case, because these women are already registered married, and it takes them like 10 to 15 years to get out of this marriage because the issue is the community is not giving them the support, not addressing the real issue. Now, it's great Admiral saying a couple to register it, but these women have done this because they've registered it, and they're employed and they're educated in the UK. They made an informed choice. But has the system really helped in that sense? Or is it that they need a different type of support?
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And then the lady on the right.
Hi. My name is Shamila. I'm a double solicitor myself from family law, and this question is sort of more towards Ahmed and a little bit towards Ajmal as well. Just really two things. I don't really understand why you think an Islamic Nikkah contract is contradictory to a civil one. I don't understand that, so I think you need to explain that. And the other issue I have is because there is slight variations in the schools of thought as to how people get married, so with the wali or without a wali, and also the divorce conditions. If people just carried on the way they did and presented themselves when they had problems to a court of whatever variety and said, well, we had an Islamic marriage, that it would still need to be codified in some way for the courts to recognise that that's a proper Islamic marriage, because there'll be so many variations. So still the code will need to be required, or some law or bylaw will be required. So really, isn't it just better to just do it the one way, which isn't contradictory? And point to Ajmal, I thought that was a very excellent piece you spoke about, but also, do you not think Islamic law isn't just personal law, it's also public law? So what we do in our private homes should be we should be able to say what we're doing at home quite proudly, what we're doing outside. We don't have a double-layered society as far as I'm concerned. So I think it's really important that, if you go out in any society you live in, you say you're married, you should say you're married according to that law, not I'm married in Islam but I'm in English law, I'm a cohabitee. So anyway.
You've mentioned quite a few points. Just to clarify, your question is why does the Nikkah contradict the civil system, and also if we were to recognise the Nikkah, wouldn't that need to be codified, so shouldn't it be better to just have one simple system? And finally?
Assalamu alaikum, good evening. My name is Omar Farooq, I'm a barrister. I work in commercial law, family and private criminal defence. Thank you very much for the panellists for their presentations. I think we haven't talked about bigamy, which is an issue, and Brother Ahmed, thank you for reminding us, approaching the whole subject in an usuli fashion. I'm quite surprised by my friend Masroor, who quoted the maqasid, and yet he is saying that it should be registered. I want to share with you a couple of practical experiences in terms of family law. For example, when we say we should take one part of the Sharia and give vulnerable women and children protection, we forget the Sharia in terms of the Sharia principles when it comes to talk about property and so forth. what's absolutely fascinating about Muslims, and I've represented men and women, so I don't have a gender bias, is that when it comes to fighting in a divorce case, as you said, Islam goes out of the window, so it doesn't matter. You'd have an imam like Mufti Barakatullah, sisters calling him up and saying, well, Mufti, I'm using the English law, I know I don't have any property rights, but I'll take the 4 houses. There's one case, 4 houses, the chap lost. And he's giving psychological advice, not really Islamic Sharia advice, so that's one. Secondly, we haven't talked about the Children Act. The Children Act protects children in any case. Thirdly, in terms of sisters these days, Muslim women, they are educated. It's an education issue. As the brother said, it's an informed choice. Some go through the civil, some do not. The Amir of Qatar and his father, they have 3 wives each. Yet, if they were to marry her, they'd fall foul of the bigamy law. The statistics...
So would you recognise, because if it was recognised there...
They recognise here, but in terms of...
potentially bigamy, it would be recognised.
Yeah, in terms of statistics, a friend of mine has a database, has 50,000 people wanting to get married. 23,000 people registered on that are divorced Muslim women with children. We as Muslims have to recognise that all these Muslim women who want to get married are not going to find single men. So what happens, because polygamy is a solution, it's not because it's there, that's what the Islam prescribes. So when we talk about registering marriages, all of these people who are in multiple marriages, they're going to face problems unless all of those are recognized. And the income, Aina Khan talked about women who are very well off. Well, many of these divorced women, they are actually very well off. They have their own houses, mortgages paid, and so forth. If they're getting married into a new relationship and they register the marriage, then 50-50, of course, the chap comes along from wherever. So I don't think it's a simple, clear-cut, this or that, Shakespearean, with us or not with us. You've really got to look at it in a whole, so comprehensive manner, and not just go on sound bites, because the audience here, well, they're going to go with me on that. And it's unfortunate that people are not approaching it on basis of values and principles and an usuli manner. And what I find fascinating is those who have no knowledge of usul, they will approach this subject and feel that they can talk about it. And the other last health warning I would give, what I found in my experience, many women who are vulnerable, they are fleeced, actually fleeced by other lawyers, majority of whom tend to be from their gender and are ineffective and are not very good at representing vulnerable people.
Thank you for that. If I understand correctly, that's a comment more than a question. Yes. Just in case I missed it.
There is it.
But thank you. Actually, the whole point of this is to encourage comments as well as questions. And I will field some more questions and comments in a moment. Can I just clarify, Islam, your question?
Yes.
What was it exactly?
In summary is that we want to... Women, in other words, most of what has been said by the panel is that if women register, then they get some sort of protection. And I understand with regards to the issue of the next of kin and ancillary benefits and so on. But I'm saying my ethnographic work is going deep, going to the grassroots, speaking to these women that go, catching them at the stage where they're either going through divorce or have been divorced. And the problem I'm finding is not the issue that they can't negotiate the system, that they're confused about what Sharia is, or what, for example, English law is. They know how to negotiate it. It's just there's a lot of barriers, a lot of problems that come in between before they get to that issue. And they wish they had help beforehand. So registering didn't help these women because majority of them had registered marriage. Yet they suffered, for example, domestic violence. Yet they suffered, for example, the in-laws interfering. So I'm just saying, we can say registry, but will it necessarily help those vulnerable people? Which I don't believe it will do, but
It'll be interesting to the panel.
Yeah, let's hear from the panel.
If I could direct those questions to different members of the panel, if there's anybody else who wishes to add to the answer, please don't hesitate. If Aina, I believe you wanted to answer the question on polygamy, that would be helpful, and Ahmed, that would be quite helpful, thank you. If I could ask Ian to answer the question about whether registering it would help these women or the system itself. I believe, Shamila, you asked your question to be directed at Ajmal and which is why does the Nikkah contradict the civil system? And would one system perhaps be better because Nikkah would need to be codified? And if we can just start off on those, I think I'll leave my question to the side about celebrants.
First one. So the first question was about bigamy and polygamy. I think we can do them all together and say, how would it impact on those people who are in polygamous relationships? If you are having the law of registration, then you're automatically going to be bigamous the next time you do a Nikkah. We don't have to wrestle with this on our own. There are plenty of examples if we look at other countries which have had polygamous marriages. Let's take Morocco, let's take Pakistan. How are they handling it? So first of all, we have the debate about whether or not there should be polygamy in this society, which is a very clear no from the current society as we have it. They prefer one marriage and the rest to be, I'm going to say it bluntly, affairs. They would prefer you to have one perfect marriage and then perhaps turn a blind eye to the next affair you're having. I've always had a problem with that. I'd rather have clarity and honesty. And if you can just look at the Quran, it says, if you cannot do justice to the orphans, marry one or two or three or four, but it is better you marry one. I hope that's roughly correct. If you cannot be fair towards them, it is better you marry one. Why don't we ever talk about the first part of it, which is if you cannot do justice to the orphans? It seems that that is thrown out and we only want to talk about polygamy. So first of all, that's a long debate, we don't have time for that. If we're going to say polygamy is an essential right of the Muslim male, let's start with that premise, that you cannot exist without polygamy. It's not possible, and you insist on that right. Whether in theory or practice, you insist on that right. The Muslim countries have resolved it in different ways. One of them is you have to have the consent of the first wife. Muslim Marriage Ordinance, 1961, Pakistan. Mudawana in Morocco, very similar, etc., etc. And I think Ian, who's an expert on the Muslim countries, will back me up on this. By no means in every Muslim country are you able to have unharnessed polygamy without either registration of the marriage or permission of the first wife or registration at the Union Council of the permission, etc. So it's not a free-for-all in Muslim countries. We can use that same analogy here, that until we have resolved our dilemma about polygamy, can we at least do justice to one wife and the children? Can we use our best endeavors to give her the best life and her to give you the best life? And then can we exercise our brains about all the other marriages we want to have? I challenge you to make one wife perfectly happy all the time.
But he won't say anything, will he, after you have said that?
It's hard, isn't it?
First of all, I just remind people that in the early days of the Prophet ﷺ, he was approached by the leaders of the Quraysh, the power elite of that time, and they said, why don't we come to a compromise? You recognise what we're doing and we'll recognise what you're doing. And he said, I'm sorry, but I can't do that. Now, coming on to this particular issue of polygamy, obviously, first of all, I'd just like to mention also that Shabana didn't ask one question: how many people would be in favour of registering a Nikkah that was recognised? Because that's what my position. It should be recognised, but there should be a system of registration, which answers the question on that, the point you raised, that you have to have certainty, and you have to, you can't have the cowboy kind of Nikkah that Ajmal kind of referred to, which has nothing to do really with the proper, true Islam. Now, my position has always been from day one, if the Nikkah is going to be recognised, then under the Sharia, a man can have up to 4 wives. And often, as one of the speakers mentioned, this actually is very inclusive, because if you look at the early history of the Muslims, people, ladies would be widowed, and other men would marry them, and so they would be absorbed into the extended family structure. It was a very merciful event. It wasn't a kind of selfish. The man says, "I want more sex." It's not about that at all. It's actually about including people in a harmonious, hopefully, and understanding situation. And from day one, I said that if the Nikkah has to be registered, it means that the law of bigamy has to be changed. Because at the moment, as Aina has correctly said, if you marry more than 2 two ladies through a recognised form of marriage, or two men, for a lady marries two men in a recognised form of marriage, that is a crime. At the same time, the people who have one perfect marriage and then a few mistresses on the side, they can take them on and drop them as they want, and there's no redress for them. Often there are many Muslims, in fact, who have more than one wife, and they may have the first marriage registered, or maybe not. Maybe they've gone through a civil ceremony as well as a Nikkah ceremony, and then they will have 2, 3, 4 wives who they'll marry under the Nikkah. It's not an offence because that marriage isn't recognised. But again, if any of those marriages break down, or if the husband dies, those second, third, fourth wife are in a very vulnerable position. They have very few rights under the English law, and this is maybe something that the cohabitation law will address. We did talk with the Law Commission about this issue and how it would impact on the Muslim community. So I've always said it's necessary to change the law of bigamy so it's not a crime. I said, obviously some people say, no, you must only have one wife. So I said, fine, let the law recognise that. If that's how you feel, if you rather have one wife than a few mistresses, the law permits that. But for a Muslim, especially one who has fear of Allah, that is not a healthy way of life.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on that? Because I say that...
I just think the reality of the situation is that, as Ahmed said, a Muslim minority in a foreign country has to comply with the local law. And the local law in the United Kingdom is that polygamy is prohibited. And I don't foresee that that's likely to change for a long time. It's possible that in the future, if Nikkah is recognised, then, as I said, there may be consequential legislation that will have to be reconsidered and reorganised. But I don't see state law in the United Kingdom accepting polygamy for a long time.
I believe Ajmal would also like to comment on that.
I think the discussion has become too much about polygamy, which is what I was afraid of it would become. Omar, you talked about usul. In this particular discussion, nobody is rejecting the usuli approach. I think this is easy to throw words. The whole discussion is based on established usul. That is given. Why do you question that? That's number one. Number two, polygamy is a sociological, Quranic solution, or a solution to social and economic crisis that may be faced by a community. It is not because of the whims of a person and their sexual desires. It's a sociological solution. So, for example, when the Bosnian government enacted a law after the Srebrenica massacre that every man must have more than one wife, they had to contradict the Quran, because Quran does not say you must have one wife. Quran says you can if you wish to. But Bosnian government, Muslim government, enacted a law to say you must, because 7,000 men have been killed, or that number. So many widows and ladies left in the society who needed that kind of a marital recognition. So they had to do that in order to solve the problem. So polygamy as a concept needs more discussion amongst ourselves, and it needs more complex analysis. So let's put the polygamy discussion on one side. My point is very simple. Your question, would it make our sisters or people more safe, or what about the vulnerability that we've talked about? I think it would. It would reduce a lot of trouble that people go through, because the state that they're in isn't recognized by the law. That's as simple as that. I don't want to say that those who may have made that choice out of their own choice, or who are registered, will not face the consequences or will not survive. I can't say that. Of course they will. But it's more likely that they will be protected. And to me, in Sharia, when you are looking at choices between two evil, you always make the lesser of the two evil as your priority. As you were talking about, I wrote down this two concept that our teachers have been talking about more lately than before, which is called the fiqh of aqalliyat, the fiqh of the minorities, and then fiqh of awlawiyat, the fiqh of priorities. So we are a minority. How do we prioritize in this context the principles of Sharia that we can share or have recognized? And Ahmed, that does not mean we're compromising on what Rasulullah was given as an option. Because in the early days of the prophetic mission, when the Quraysh came and said, stop worshipping one God, except our God, the idols, that's when Prophet said, I will never do this. We're not talking about or recognizing idols. We're not talking about anything else. We're talking about recognition and protecting our community. Sacrosanct values of our deen is not going to be compromised. Nobody is asking us to accept anything but one God. We can choose, that's our choice. Pray as much as you like. Here is a family issue. How can we protect our families more? And I'm saying registering our marriage and registering Nikkah as a valid contract, Ahmed, would enable that protection to be more in our community than without it.
Thank you. That's an ideal segue into Islam's question, which is, does registration really address the vulnerabilities of the women that might fall victim to it?
Can I just preface that with a general comment about registration? The whole of the project and the whole of the discussion tonight has been about registering an Islamic marriage, a Nikkah. But actually the terminology is not really correct, because what's being asked of the Muslim community at the moment is that they have a separate marriage ceremony, a secular civil marriage ceremony, as well as a religious ceremony. Now, we may call that registering a marriage, but it's not really doing so. It's insisting that a particular religious community in the UK can only be included within state law by going down a route that they don't necessarily want to go down. And this, I think, is probably where, in relation to how is an Islamic contract different from a civil contract, there are, under the Marriage Act, there are certain words you have to use in the civil ceremony.
To the exclusion of all others.
Which aren't necessarily ones that a Muslim would necessarily be happy with. So to talk about registering an Islamic marriage is really a misnomer, because having a ceremony which you can then add on a registration isn't at the moment permissible. It's permissible for the Church of England, it's permissible for the Jewish community, it's permissible for the Quaker community, but it's not permissible for any other religious community. In the Middle East, as I said, registration as part of, as an addition to an Islamic form of marriage has become absolutely commonplace. And it's become an administrative provision, so that almost no Islamic marriages that I've ever dealt with in the Middle East these days are not registered in some way or another, because they're done either before a marriage registrar or they're done in court. Even in Saudi Arabia, an Islamic, a so-called backstreet or cowboy Nikkah, whatever we have to call it, doesn't take place. Families don't allow it, because you can't, if you don't register it, if you don't do it in front of the court or a marriage registrar in Saudi Arabia, you can't get an iqama, you can't get onto somebody's family card, you can't get your children into school, you can't do any of these things. Now, the situation in England, frankly, is not a good one. Asking the Muslim community go through this extra civil ceremony of marriage isn't really a form of registration. And it's at the moment the best thing possible to bring vulnerable people within the state umbrella. And you're absolutely right that only gives a partial protection. It mainly gives a financial protection, but it's not going to give you a protection in relation to the issues of domestic violence, the issues of interference and so on, as you said. But at the financial level, at least that's giving a certain amount of support. But ultimately, as well as suggesting to present people that they go through the only route in which they can come into state law, there really needs to be a lobbying that the Muslim community and other religious communities that are not within the system of religious ceremony plus registration really must come about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. You made it very well. Thank you.
I think that's also touched on your question about why the Nikkah might contradict the civil system.
The one contradiction is obvious, which is the mahar. In the civil registration, there is nothing called mahar. Or there is no requirement for wali, but within Islamic law there are difference of opinion, of course.
So could you explain these concepts?
Oh, sorry.
They're not
Okay.
listed.
So, for example, when you are getting married in Islam, like I said, two people have to give their consent. There has to be a mahar that is agreed between the man and the woman, and there should be two witnesses. I'm including all the criteria now, primary and the secondary. It should be publicly solemnized, and there should be wali. Those are the universally agreed upon principles. Whether wali should be present or not, the schools debate. And whether the woman should waive the mahar or not is also debated, but let's not go down the route of debate only. So mahar is a man must give something that he will feel the commitment to the contract with. So if he's earning £100,000 salary, for example, and he says, I'm going to give you £100, I'm sorry, that's a joke. That to me is not mahar, that's a joke. You should be giving something that really marks your commitment to the contract. That's the reason why you're giving mahar. My wife was very clever. She said to me, my mahar to you is you will pay for my hajj. I said, brilliant. And this was 15 years ago, right? She asked me to take her to hajj last year. And I'd taken her to hajj 15 years ago, and I paid £500. When I took her last year, I paid £5,000. But that's her prerogative. She can ask for anything she wants. So that's the only thing that's primarily missing from the civil registration, from what I know. The others are secondary conditions. If the civil registration included mahar, in my view, I've heard the registrars giving speech, they sound as good as Islamic speeches, except they don't quote Quran, I understand that. So if we can train the registrars to perhaps quote Quran a bit, and we have to discuss it, I'm just making a joke out of it. The discussion is that there is a lot of scope for collaboration. It's not in conflict, it's complementary. And as long as we put our case forward as a complementary process, it's more likely, I believe, we will win.
Could I just add to that very briefly? Yeah. It's just this, that when you go through the Nikkah ceremony, it is, you say, the parties say we agree to this contract in accordance with the Sharia and the Sunnah. And so there's a whole lot that comes in with it. So for example, if we have misunderstandings between us, we will settle it in accordance with the Sunnah. If the marriage ends, we will settle it in accordance with the Sunnah. All of these provisions are there. We may never need to call on them, but they're there. When you go through the civil ceremony, there's none of that. And what really contradicts the Nikkah is that you have to commit to the other person to the exclusion of all others.
You could do a prenup.
Yes.
In that prenup, you can actually say, we'll refer to the Quran and the Sunnah to solve our problem.
Exactly.
You actually have to say to the
I
exclusion of others.
understand.
So
but when I do Nikkah, I issue a contract which actually says, and it becomes a prenup. And it would be as good as that to you as a lawyer. So I think there is a compromise.
But you see, what I'm saying is it's much easier if you just recognise the
Well, of course I
and
do.
then register it. Then you're there.
One suggestion might be that the civil marriage ceremony, which is actually a very simple ceremony in law, requiring only, could have an added religious ceremony to it.
Yeah.
So the religious ceremony could take place at the same time as the civil ceremony, and if necessary in the civil registrar's office. Unfortunately, the present law is that you're prohibited from using any form of religious wording, any form of religious ceremony, together with the civil marriage. You're allowed to add all sorts of vows, all sorts of wording, but the registrar will stop you if any of it has any sort of religious significance of whatever type. So, again, possibly scope for a more minor change, but one that might help long term.
If I could, it's probably going to be the last field of comments and questions. So if I could have a show of hands for anybody who'd like to ask a comment or question. So, sorry. So if I could have the lady in the second row and the lady in the third row, and the, apologies, I put their hands up first, the two gentlemen in the row on my right. So I'll just let things settle down for a minute before I continue. So could I have the question from the lady in the second row?
My question is based on the head.
Yes. Sorry, do you mind? Do you mind if we can keep this as quiet as possible? We are recording still, so it's quite helpful for the people who couldn't attend tonight to watch this video. And could you start by introducing your name?
Yeah,
and
my name
what you
is
do?
Shanaz, and I'm not a lawyer or anything. I'm just here because I'm interested in the actual subject. My question is,
I'll repeat the question.
with regard to the meher. You spoke about having an Islamic contract and having a civil contract, and then you talked about meher. Meher is, from what I understand, a very important part of the Islamic
Essential
contract.
part.
So, looking at what you said, Aina, about the financial problems that the ladies have, if a meher, for example, is given for £5,000 this year, and in 7 years' time the marriage breaks up, how would registering an Islamic marriage with a meher of £5,000, for example, have an impact on a marriage that breaks down in 7 years? Is that going to be counted in? Are you going to add to that? Or are you going to say that's a nominal sum that should be part of an English way of, working? Plus the other gentleman mentioned that actually in Islamic law, you have the meher and that's it. Then the woman doesn't have the right to all the other stuff that a man may or may not have. So how would all these considerations be weighed up when you are actually presenting, registering an Islamic marriage?
I just want to answer that in due course. If I could have the lady in the third row.
My name is Aisha Jamil. I've been a family barrister for 20 years. I come across cases where we have women, and it really breaks my heart because they haven't registered their marriage and they find actually they have no recourse to finances. Now the gentleman at the front, he said that what difference does it make to register the marriage? As far as I'm concerned, only financial, because in domestic violence and all other situations, even if you don't register, you still have some recourse, you have equal recourse to the courts. But my concern is this: why are we beating ourselves up with further civil liberties being deprived? Because if you're going to say there should be criminal sanctions for not registering the marriage, are we going to criminalize Muslims? And that really concerns me, because a lot of Muslims don't want to. I think it should be an informed choice. You should be given information for the vulnerable ladies. They should be advised when the Nikkah is taking place that they have the option to register their marriage. They should be told about the pros and cons of that, and if they don't do it, what happens. But that should be an informed choice. We should also have the choice not to register the marriage, because there are many people who don't want to have legal marriages. And why not have the option to see how the Nikkah goes? Because we can't live in sin if you're a practicing Muslim. So to avoid fornication, you have a Nikkah. Now, many people may want to have the option of living together before there are any legal sanctions. Therefore, let's see how the Nikkah goes, perhaps register in a year. Why should I be criminalized with that option? Now, the last thing I want you to think about is there are many different sects, and I'm not of the Shia sect, but what about muttas, which has temporary marriages? Now, Shias may say you're taking away our civil liberties because we have a right to have a temporary marriage. Why should we have to register that? And why should we be criminalized for not registering it?
Okay, so I'm going to pick out, because we have a number of other speakers, so the most notable question in that is, I think really, are we criminalising Muslims by criminalising not registration of it? Or by making it a legal requirement? And I'll direct that then to Aina. I think we've both done work and we know the effects of requiring mosques to register and what impact that has on demand that mosques have for Nikkah ceremonies. I think there were two gentlemen on my right, so if I could ask the far right.
Thank you very much. I'm Vishal Vora, I'm with SOAS. My question is, I'm a huge advocate of the celebrant system that is operating in Scotland, and I was slightly alarmed that someone in the panel said that the celebrant system doesn't seem to be working in Scotland, and if that could be fleshed out a bit, because my research shows that it is working incredibly well for British Muslims.
And it's because of your research that I started off with that question, so thank you for coming tonight. I think that came from Aina as well, but without directing too many questions at Aina, I'll ask if the other members of the panel could also give their views on whether that's an effective system. And lastly?
My name is Samir Mahmood. I practice as a family barrister and also immigration. A question for Ian. I think it was mentioned that about 80% of the mosques aren't registered. And if you could explain the significance of that. I wasn't quite clear on that, what the significance is of the ones that aren't registered. as opposed to the ones that are, and how that at all assists with the topic.
Okay, so to really explain what that comment is within context and so you can understand the issue a bit better. If I could direct that to both Ahmed and Ian, I think that might be best answered by them. Obviously all these questions probably will be answered by all our panellists, but let's start off then with Ahmed. Sorry, Ajmal. You're going to answer first.
I can be Ahmed if you like.
No. My name is
I have known Brother Ahmed for a long time. I have admiration for you, nothing but that. So, what does Sharia say about wealth distribution when it comes to marriage and divorce? It's something that needs to be ironed out, and I don't think we have enough time to understand it. Look, in Islam, if a husband and a wife have a relationship, they're in a marriage, they've got children or no children, and they have a divorce, Sharia does take a very close look at how the wealth is distributed. It's not automatically that the man walks away with everything and woman is left free with nothing. That's a myth, that's an assumption made based on culture. So we need to, of course, expound on that. We need to have that discussion here in this room. But I just want you to know that Sharia does not say that the woman doesn't get anything. That is not true. Now, before you get married, any wealth that you bring into the marriage, according to Islam, is your wealth. Whether it is a man's wealth or woman's wealth, it's your wealth. The other party has no right over it. Any money that you get as inheritance from your families, your spouse has no right over it. Any wealth that you get as gift dedicated to you, even if you're married, nobody else has a right over it. It's yours. Anything that you make together, or as a result of facilitating the other, surely Sharia is not blind to those facts, and therefore when the marriage is finished, or if it ends, it will not just say, okay, the man, you go ahead, take all your wealth and run. That's not the purpose of marriage. And the purpose of mahar isn't to provide a protection to anybody. It isn't to say, okay, the woman may get divorced one day and therefore there is a protection for her. But you're absolutely right. £5,000, in my case £500, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is nothing for today. The value has changed. That is now £15,000 or £5,000. So, are we going to say inflationary rate must be added to the mahar? We can't say that. Mahar is not a protection for divorce. Mahar is a sign of commitment. So let's separate that. So I want you to be very clear about that. And I just want to, I'm itching to say this about mut'a marriage. It's not just mut'a marriage, but many other. There is a misyar marriage that has been recently introduced in the Middle East. Look, really blunt and brutal about it. Forgive me if you don't like it, and I'm apologizing before. I don't support mut'a or misyar marriage. To me, it's no different than prostitution. I'm really sorry, but it's no different. Marriage is to a person that you're committed to. And it is not for a period of time when you can run away from that. If you're getting married with the intention of a divorce, that's not even a marriage, as far as I'm concerned. So I am saying we need to really be mature about it. If my Shia brothers and sisters hold this value as something very important, I respect them for that opinion. But I want to have the right to challenge them. To say to them, I don't think your practice is actually conducive to the overall spirit of Islam. And I want my Shia brothers to say the same thing to the Sunni brothers, to say your practice perhaps is also in contradiction. So to create a value system that is universal, we need to come back to the spirit of marriage. What is the spirit of marriage? It's for a man and a woman to commit together, to share their life together in emotional, in spiritual, and in physical realms, so that safe space, that you create that safe space, God can fill it up, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, mercy and love. If that's the spirit of marriage, I'm really sorry. Secretive, temporary, backstreet, none of those fulfill that criteria of safe space. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And if we could move on to, I think it's Aisha's question, which has somewhat been answered, but whether the legal requirement of criminalise perhaps Muslims. If I could ask,
I think maybe
anyone want to answer this? Yeah.
So the question was that are we criminalising Muslims by asking the state to say that Muslim marriages should be registered, and if you do not register it, you will have criminal penalties? Yes?
Yes.
What does a Muslim country do? Do you know?
Well, you see,
They put you in jail if you don't register the marriage.
You can't compare
You
it
have to
because you
compare
have
it.
polygamy, which
Well,
is
if you compare it, then you
No.
recognise the Nikkah
But
marriage.
you recognise polygamy here as well. It's complete. You're
No,
playing with different
no,
goals.
I need to answer
Before we
this.
descend
That's
into
a red herring.
debates,
I can't have a debate with you. If
Yeah,
I can
if we
just
can just
answer,
answer.
and you're free to disagree, but I have to answer it, please. We must look at how Islam is practiced in other Muslim countries, and then here, the diaspora is now growing old. There'll be a new generation, third generation and younger, who have no connection to the homeland, and there'll be reverts here or converts who want an English or Angrezi Sharia. So we have to meet all those needs. We can't just keep talking about what Muslim countries have done. But it serves as a good example how they wrestled with the same problem. They have said, as Ian very correctly said, there is no Middle Eastern country, there is no Muslim country, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, where you can have unregistered marriages. We only have that freedom here to have Nikkah marriages which are not registered. You cannot do that in any Muslim state. Why? Because of the amount of harm that comes out of having unregistered marriages. It's got to be a public declaration, as you said. Everyone needs to know who is married to who is fathering who, and who is responsible for who. Not reliant on the state, not reliant on the families. You too have to connect and support each other. And if it goes wrong, again, you have to support each other out of that with mercy and kindness. So none of this nonsense, as far as I'm concerned, will prevail anymore. It's a red herring. Don't criminalize Muslims. I'm not making it a Muslim issue. We're here as a Muslim circle to discuss it, therefore we're talking about Muslims. It will apply equally to every faith. Anybody, like a Fleet Street vicar in the old days, who would be called out to say, quickly, can you do a back street marriage, would now go to jail. And they do. Often, registrars are caught doing sham marriages and they go to jail. It's not about Muslims, so please don't start this debate on that basis. Otherwise, it will be the poor me victim mentality while people suffer as we speak. Let's grow up as a community and be mature and protect ourselves. We don't need protection from anyone else.
Yes, if Emma would like to add.
I think we have to be careful when we say what are the other Muslim countries doing, because really as a result of the European colonial era, most of the legal systems that they have little sprinklings of Sharia law, but they don't actually have a legal system that is based on the broad Sharia that the Prophet brought originally. And I've always said that the closer you are to what the Prophet brought, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the better your society is going to be, because what he brought was based on wisdom and compassion and mercy. And I think the point that Aina has raised is this, that she said, well, in a Muslim country, if you don't register, then you are criminalised. But the point is, at least in those countries, the Nikkah marriage is recognised as a valid marriage. So the first step is, what I'm always saying is, first recognise the Nikkah marriage as a valid marriage, and also require it to be registered. I wouldn't criminalise it, because I think in the end, you have to call people to have taqwa and to be fearful of Allah, that if they don't honour the contract, there will be consequences for them in this world and the next, which won't be pleasant. And if I could just illustrate, really from my own experience, because I think it might help. My previous marriage was with a lady who's from Ahl Kitab. She wasn't a Muslim. We had the Nikkah marriage, and she said, look, I don't feel properly married. I don't feel secure. And I said, we'll have the civil ceremony as well, so that our marriage is recognised by the law of the land. And in my heart, I said, what matters to me is the Nikkah marriage. I don't mind putting her fears at rest, because I will honour that contract. As it turned out, the marriage didn't work out. We amicably divorced. And when it came to sharing our possessions, we were having arguments, not who should have what, but in a different way. I was saying, you should have this. She said, no, you have it. And I said, no, you have it. So we were arguing in that way. When it came to maintaining the children, that whatever the law of the land was at the time said, this is how much you should pay for the maintenance of your children. And I wrote back and I said, no, you're wrong. Actually, I'm married under the Sharia. And in fact, I should be paying twice what you say I should be paying. So I will be paying what the Sharia requires, not what you require. And because what they required was being taken care of, they didn't complain. But this is one way of actually dealing with divorce, bil ma'ruf, which is what we're commanded to in the Quran. And then even if you want to register in the way that Aina is talking about, and having two ceremonies, you can do it because if you honour Sharia, you will never need to have recourse to the civil.
But it should be a choice.
It should be a choice, yeah.
Just to clarify, Aina's answer was discussing celebrants being criminalised, not the parties themselves. Before we descend into further debate on that, I'd like to move on. Vishal raised the question of celebrants. I'd like to start by asking Ian to explain what that actually means to the non-legal in the audience and your position on this, and then perhaps if Aina could elaborate with why you feel that it's not an effective system in Scotland.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps I can add together the question of the other gentleman. The present law, as I said at the beginning, is that some mosques in England and elsewhere can register so that they're not only a place of worship, but they're a place where Islamic marriages can take place and be registered and considered as valid marriages within the UK, within England. Woking Mosque is one. I dealt with a case relatively recently in relation to Leeds Grand Mosque, which is also registered, which I hadn't realised. And in those cases, the Nikkah ceremony takes place in the mosque and is registered in the same way that the Church of England marriage is registered, or a Jewish or a Quaker marriage is registered. You don't need another ceremony of marriage. The marriage is simply accepted because the mosque celebrant, or the mosque, sorry, is accepted as a registered place for the celebration of marriage. Now, one of the problems is that a large number of mosques are not registered. The Regent's Park Mosque, for example, astonishingly, I've never understood why, is not registered. Large numbers of Saudis think that it is often, and the large numbers of cases I've dealt with are of Muslims who go to the Regent's Park Mosque and expect that because it's the great, wonderful mosque in London, they will have a marriage that's recognised by the state. No, it's not. And there is clearly some sort of obstacle to further registration. That occurred in Wales, that occurred in Scotland, but the Welsh and the Scottish have recent legislation, 2010 in Wales, I can't remember when Scotland is, which have allowed for the registration of individuals to celebrate a marriage. So people can apply and can be accepted as a celebrant of an Islamic marriage, an Islamic marriage ceremony. And then the Nikkah will be considered by the state. Now, I said that it wasn't working very well. I'm afraid to say I had that on the information given to me this morning. Otherwise, I didn't have any independent information.
So I'm happy to clarify. So I'm happy to clarify that. I was of the same opinion as you, Vishal, up till Friday. I actually thought celebrant-based was the answer. It works very well in most countries that we know. And what is celebrant-based? I don't know if you all know this. It doesn't have to be a minister of the faith. It can be any individual, an uncle, a friend. It can be a temporary license or a permanent license. You get a license from the local authority to perform a marriage. This is how it actually works. In Muslim countries, it's the actual, it could be the imam, generally. It can be your uncle who gets the registration performed, gets the certificate signed, and then has to go and lodge it with a local council and issue it, the sealed certificate in triplicate to the parties. So it's all very, very clear. That celebrant gets criminal sanctions if they don't perform those duties within set times. Sometimes it's 7 days, sometimes it's 28 days. If it's working generally very, very well, then you'd think celebrant is the way to go. I was very shocked actually because I had a call from Aina Foundation, which is the leading women's charity in Glasgow, and you can all Google it and have a look. They said they're following my campaign Register Our Marriage very closely because they're having parallel problems north of the border. I was really shocked. I didn't have time to phone them, so I said, can you quickly email me what are the issues that you can see? Because I thought you had it really good up there. And they said, sadly, in Muslim cases, which they deal with as a Muslim charity, about 2/3 of marriages are not being registered by Muslims. And when I said, could you clarify, she broke it down by communities, Arab, Asian, South Asian, she called it, and I can, she's allowed me to show the email. It can be by age, she's broken it down, but what she's specifically saying is, when she, for example, herself wanted to get married, she couldn't find one mosque that would accept that they could just have an unregistered Nikkah. The mosques are all compliant, they're being really good, and they're always registering the marriages. It's the roving imams, the backstreet imams, the cowboys that are growing hugely, who are able to be bought, sadly. They get a nice fee for performing marriages which are not legally registered. And that's grown hugely, and it's troubling her as a woman who gets calls on domestic violence and all the other raft of issues that at least, yes, we're not saying with marriage you're going to guarantee a violence-free marriage. It's not going to happen. There's no guarantees. That you will not be made homeless overnight, and you will have some recourse to a roof over your head very quickly by an English law judge. That's the difference.
Thank you. I believe Ahmed has a question.
Yeah, Aina, could you maybe just clarify, where the celebrant is registered, does that mean there's not a need for two separate ceremonies? Is it like as Ian's described?
Exactly. So you could go to the home, like you do in a Muslim country. In Scotland you could go to the garden, the living room, wherever you wanted to have the marriage, as long as you register, I understand.
So does that mean we might see Ajmal kind of registering as a celebrant in
There's
Scotland?
There's a big business out
and
there.
going to Gretna Green to
There is.
Are you trying to get rid of me from England?
And are you suggesting coach parties or people to Gretna Green?
Maybe because I'm grateful to Vishal for ending us on a question that I started with, but I'd like to refer back to you because I feel you have a follow-up question or comment.
I'm very grateful for you accepting my sort of follow-up comment, but the reason I said that the system, I would still stand by saying it does work, because there seem to be a commensurate number of Muslim celebrants in Scotland. So it's fantastic, that's why these forums are so helpful, because we're all pulling in the same direction, and it's something I'll definitely follow up. But of all the celebrants, I've spoken to National Records Scotland, they are very happy with the system. There are some 7% Muslim celebrants in Scotland operating actively, so it's very interesting to hear what you said about this foundation.
I'd like that.
That's a solution.
I want that,
Okay, great. Well,
I did actually approach my local council. They called me up the other day and they said, would you like to be registered to do the Nikkah? I said, I don't think you've understood your own law. I can't be registered. You have to ask my mosque to be registered. She goes, oh, that's what I actually meant. I was really excited when she said, would you like to be registered? I said, that would be a great thing to do. But then she said, no, really, I will clarify that. So unfortunately, but if it was done, wow!
You could be registered in Scotland, couldn't you?
I don't want to go to Scotland, it's too cold. Sorry, I didn't mean that.
But if enough people were doing that, they said, well, perhaps we better follow suit in England.
That's the reason why we should not give Scotland independence, you see.
It's 10 to 9. I have to say I'm really impressed that such a large number of you have stayed with us to the end. I hope that you've all picked up on and learned new things. I personally have. Before you all start filtering away, there are a few things I'd like to bring to your attention. Aina has started the Register Our Marriage campaign. You can get more details of that online if you would like to read more about that. It's an interesting campaign. It's obviously raising some awareness. Also, Ajmal Masroor, the speaker on my far left, has a book which is 10 Things You Should Know About Marriage. It's retailing at $6.99, but today he's kindly offered to give it to you for £5. Not free, I'm sorry. And it's at the back. And last but not least, I'm going to end how I started. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you so much for the questions and comments. And if we could have a round of applause for the speakers who volunteered. Enlightening to hear from each of you, and you have such incredibly different experiences and different views. It's been enriching for me to listen to. We always try and hold these kinds of lectures, so I'm going to urge you again, if you'd like to attend any other lectures, if you'd like to know more about the Friday lectures, the Saturday School or the Homeless Project, there's a sign-up sheet at the back. Please do add your email address and name. If you are here for CPD points, that again, there is a land building chambers, which is where I'm based, and that sign-up sheet for CPD points is also at the back.
Barristers as well as
For barristers as well as solicitors. So please, and speakers get double, so definitely sign up. And again, I'd like to urge you to remember that even hiring a venue like this costs money, and we are a charity. So if you could pick up the slip that gives you the information on where you can donate, pick up the standing order form, or if you've just got some loose change in your pocket, there's a change jar at the back. That's really all I have to say. Our speakers may hang around, I'm not sure, but we have taken enough of their time. If you would like to speak to each other on these issues, please do. We do have this venue for a good half an hour. Thank you.